My name is Kimberly Foster, and here's a picture of how I dressed in professional attire during my field placement. My elementary field placement was at Washington Elementary School, which is located at 545 South Ann Street, Lancaster, PA, zip code 17602. I was placed in a K-4 classroom, otherwise known as kindergarten for 4-year-olds. The date and hours of visitation at this location were on November 2nd, November 9th, and November 16th, all from 8 a.m. to 12 p.m. The name of the teacher whom I was placed with at Washington Elementary School is Christina Buchmoyer. Her email address is clbuchmoyer@lancaster.k12.pa.us. Mrs. Buchmoyer teaches the subjects of reading, writing, math, and science, all in her classroom. Here is a picture of the classroom that Mrs. Buchmoyer teaches in 5 days a week. Mrs. Buchmoyer has 20 students in her classroom. The percentage of students with a disability is 15%, or 3 out of 20 students. The 3 students with disabilities all have speech impairments. Mrs. Buchmoyer is also having another student tested currently for a disability. In the classroom, there are 11 girls and 9 boys. There are 3 different races evident in Mrs. Buchmoyer's classroom. There are 16 Hispanic students, 3 African American students, and 1 Caucasian student. The students in the classroom are either 4 or 5, but many of the students are 4 at this current time. The grade level of the students in the classroom is K-4 or kindergarten for 4-year-olds. On the 4th slide, there is a picture of an example of an accommodation located in Mrs. Buchmoyer's classroom. The photo is showing an example of how the words in the classroom are in both the English and Spanish language. This represents a good practice for the students in the classroom because 16 out of 20, or 80% of the students in the classroom, are Hispanic, and many of them only hear the Spanish language at home. There are also several students who are unable to speak English very well, so this helps them visually see what the words mean in both languages. This accommodation relates to the topic of English learners that we read about in our book in Chapter 3 and talked about in our discussions in class. Some of the students in the classroom are English learners, and those diagnosing students with disabilities need to realize that just because a student cannot speak English in the United States does not mean they have a disability. On the 5th slide, there is a picture of an accommodation that Mrs. Buchmoyer could use for the students in her class that have speech impairments. The picture is an example of an augmentative and alternative communication, or AAC, device that students with speech impairments can use to get their ideas across without having to speak aloud. In Chapter 11 in the book, the author discusses how important AAC devices can be to children with these types of impairments, especially when a severe speech impairment is occurring. Not only did we discuss AAC in Chapter 11 and with speech impairments, but AAC devices can be used for more than just helping students with speech impairments. Something like this could come in handy for Mrs. Buchmoyer and her current individuals with disabilities in the classroom, and also for future students with disabilities to come through her classroom. On the 6th slide, there's a picture of what a spelling test of someone with a speech impairment could look like. Students who are diagnosed with a speech impairment have a speech-language pathologist, or SLP, who works with the student outside and inside the classroom. One way Mrs. Buchmoyer could provide an accommodation to her students with a speech impairment is by giving the SLP a copy of the spelling test so the SLP can work on the words on the spelling test with the student one-to-one. We discussed different accommodations for students with speech impairments and about SLPs in our discussion about Chapter 11 in class, and we were also able to learn more about speech impairments and accommodations for students with these disabilities by reading Chapter 11. On the 7th slide, there's a picture of visuals that Mrs. Buchmoyer uses for students in the classroom who could be legally deaf, or they just learn better when they see things visually. Therefore, this represents best practices for special education because it provides an alternative way for students who are deaf to understand something, and the same thing for those who just learn better visually. In class and in the book, there was discussion about how you must manipulate different materials to make sure you can reach every student in the classroom, which is seen through these visuals that Mrs. Buchmoyer wears around her neck. On the 8th slide, there's a picture of a daily schedule that the teacher uses every day to make sure her students know what is happening. The daily schedule is important because it structures out the day for the children and it keeps it consistent for those students who need things to stay the same every day to function properly. One of the important things the students do on their daily schedule is have a morning meeting. The morning meeting helps students and the teacher to remain on the same page for events occurring throughout the day. The morning meeting includes plans for the day, weather, day of the week, a good morning message from the teacher, and a sentence about how a selected student's week was going. During a discussion in class, we discussed how it is important for some students with disabilities to have similarly structured days so the student is not thrown off guard and gets angry or upset with the teacher or gets angry at other students in the class. On slides 9, 10, and 11, there will be examples of observed behavioral, organizational, and motivational materials for those in a special education learning environment. On the 9th slide, there's a picture of organizational materials that Mrs. Buchmauer uses for the books in her classroom. The books are organized by different topics, such as books about food, feelings, and pets. Mrs. Buchmauer has labeled bins for the books in the classroom, so the students can more easily put the books back in the correct places. This organizational material is both helpful to any type of student and to the teacher. On the 10th slide, there is a picture of behavioral material that Mrs. Buchmauer uses for students in her classroom. Mrs. Buchmauer has a behavior chart in her room that she uses every day to track the students. The behavior chart is based on the actions of the students throughout the day. For example, one day a student was able to get around for lunch first, and the student got to move the clothespin from ready to learn to great job, because the student was doing what she was told to do in a quick and safe manner. Students with disabilities usually lack a consistently good behavior because their disability is interfering with their learning of when to display the correct behavior. In Chapter 9 of the book, behavior modification and cognitive behavior modification are discussed and how these interventions can take place to help children with disabilities change their behaviors about different things. Ideas such as positive reinforcement can be used to keep a good behavior going. Therefore, Mrs. Buchmauer provides her students with positive reinforcement by rewarding her students for good behavior. That way they continue to try and do the correct thing. On the 11th slide, there is a picture of motivational material that the teacher uses to make students feel important in the classroom. The motivational material that Mrs. Buchmauer uses is a job chart. The teacher gives each student a special job in the classroom that each student must take care of. The jobs change each week, so the students get a special job each week. The fact that the children are given a special job means that there are no arguments in the classroom about who gets to do what. The jobs include things such as a meteorologist, door holder, sanitation engineer, veterinarian, and many more. These jobs motivated the children because these jobs motivated the students to impress their teacher with their jobs and try to impress their teacher by doing their best at their jobs. This represents best practices for those with disabilities because the students need to feel that they are important to the class. Motivation can influence what skills a student with a disability can develop, and how these skills will help with how well the student can cope with both their teacher and the other students, which is something we have discussed in class several times and read about in Chapter 6. On the 12th slide, I have my first reflection of my field experience in my elementary placement at Washington Elementary School. Before I was placed in this setting with a couple of students with disabilities, I had little to no experience working with individuals with disabilities. My first impressions of the school included the windows of the school giving off a prison-like look. The classroom looked like any other elementary classroom, and the class had a large group of minority students. Since being in the placement and at this elementary school, I have a stronger belief in the power of being able to help students with disabilities. Before this placement, I had an appreciation for special education teachers, but now seeing teachers work with students with disabilities, I have an even greater appreciation for these teachers. Inclusion is also more important than ever in the classroom. Inclusion makes students feel equal, all while getting their own help when needed. On the 13th slide, I have my second reflection of my field experience in my elementary placement at Washington Elementary School. Since going into this placement, I have realized how important inclusion is and how each student with a disability should be included in a general education classroom each day. I believe inclusion is more effective because the individuals with disabilities will feel more important and equal being able to be in a classroom with individuals who do not have disabilities. In the classroom, each child is truly unique and each student has different needs to attend to, and with that, the teacher needs specific materials tailored to each student. Since being in a classroom with individuals who have disabilities, I have some new questions regarding special education and inclusion in the classroom. My first question is, are there cases where students are removed from the room if they're causing too much commotion for the rest of the students in the classroom? And my second question is, how much time does it take outside of class to help those with disabilities, such as creating different materials tailored toward these students? There are some of the materials and instructions that I will consider using in my classroom that I saw in Mrs. Buchmoyer's classroom, such as the job chart, behavior chart, visuals, and the Spanish-English words as needed for each student in the classroom. The reason I would use these materials and instruction is because it is important for each student to feel important. It's also important for children to see how behavior changes daily, important to attend to different types of learners, and it is important for students who speak Spanish more fluently to start learning words more easily in English, and this is one way to do that. Finally, on the last slide of the PowerPoint, there are 2 pictures of my field experience hour logs at Washington Elementary School and at KinderCare in Lancaster. Thank you for taking a journey through Washington Elementary School with me and through the classroom of K-4 teacher Mrs. Buchmoyer.